Hello, William. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Well, really my pleasure. Really my pleasure. Yeah, there's a bit of a story. The listeners won't know to the significance of us finally being here doing this episode because a
Yeah,
rather lot of time has passed since we originally intended to create this, and
it's true.
we've since become great friends. And then finally, we're actually doing the thing that we first connected over. So it feels like a
Right, yeah.
momentous event. We maybe will never be friends again after
Right
this.
after this, it was the end. Oh, okay, we're done
That's
here.
it. But no, I'm really happy that we're getting to have this conversation. And as I was just saying, um, it it was triggered. It's first catalyzed for me to invite you on the show based on a post I saw you write on this topic.
Right.
And I've intentionally never asked you to say too much. I mean, it's obviously come up in conversation, but I've intentionally not asked much about this so that I can ask you now. So I can't
Right.
wait.
No, yeah. I can't wait to hear the questions. And I love the fact that you had the foresight to withhold those questions. That's amazing. I love that.
Mm. Yeah, I really, as much as I can, love to have this be a real conversation, like a conversation I actually
Yeah.
want to be in. So
Yeah.
yeah, let's see. I don't yet know what quite the questions will be. We'll see. So I know one thing I want to start with. Again, this might be an interesting conversation. The fact that we're talking about two words that, you can tell the difference when you see them writing. When we're saying them aloud, we're going to have to somehow distinguish that one of them,
Right.
it starts with an F, one
It's
of them
different.
starts with a PH. But
Right.
William, let's
Yes.
start with a definition of what's meant by this idea of fantasy versus fantasy.
Right. Okay. So yeah, so the post in question, obviously that you're talking about is I wrote about this concept of the distinction between fantasy versus fantasy, and the one way that I spelled fantasy was with a PH, and this is an old sort of, and I think it's old. I don't know how relevant it is to current psychoanalytic thought or practice, but in the old school thought of fantasy, it was spelled with a PH to sort of illustrate, and I've summarized. I'm summarizing this in a bit more of a succinct way than there's a lot of literature on it, but that kind of nuance and breaks it down into further distinction. But in general, this idea of fantasy with a PH, it was associated with the idea of um, uh, that the specters of the past, so the PH being related etymologically to phantasm, that the specters of the past are projecting onto the world. And so we create fantasy through this sort of PH phantasmical perspective of the world based on the specters of the past, these specters being the ghosts of things that could have been. And
Mhm.
so we project that onto the world. And then there's fantasy with an F, the way that we generally talk about fantasy. But from a psychoanalytic perspective or psychological perspective, that fantasy with an F being sort of a conscious engagement of imagining things and
Mm.
being very consciously aware of the fact that we are imagining the world to be a way that we hope it will be and being honest and accountable about that.
Mm.
And so, yeah, that's in a nutshell, that's the distinction between the two things.
Lovely. Yeah, really nice and clear. And I think it's one of those, when I saw your original post talking about this,
Mm,
it really struck me as like, this isn't a new idea. This is a kind of, we see these concepts show up in various ways, any of us that are kind of in this kind of work.
sure.
Yet I think there's something so clear and therefore so helpful to have those two different types of fantasy juxtaposed in that way. I think it creates this
Yeah.
really functional way of engaging with both, or
Yeah, I
creates the
think yeah,
invitation for that.
there's a distinction between when we can make well, I think so much of this work too, this kind of touches on another point, but I think so much of this work, this personal development work is and specifically, on maybe more esoteric levels, if you will, for in the sense that they're complex and it's not easy to sort of get to,
Mm.
is that when we can have that sort of analytical process where we can make these sorts of very nuanced distinctions between things, we are in a psychological process of what we would call differentiating. We're differentiating what is normally conflated, right? That
Mm.
there are really there's so much nuance to thematical or archetypal structures in our minds that are amalgamations of predominantly subconscious and unconscious material. And because it's subconscious and unconscious, it's their senses and feelings and ideas and generalizations that all get conflated into something. And when we're willing to take the time to really sit with um, a concept of any kind and begin pulling it apart and differentiating and compartmentalizing, in this case, fantasy versus fantasy, it allows us to see more clearly how we show up in the world and how we present ourselves to not only to the world but to ourselves. What are the masks that we're wearing? What is the personas that we put on? By being able to look at specifically the distinction of fantasy versus fantasy, one being with a PH, the other with an F, is that you then can start having that conversation with you or yourself on a more conscious level because you've made that distinction. So I 100% agree. Yeah.
Mm. I just had a really silly thought. I was like, oh, if we had subtitles on this, it'd be fine then, because people just read the subtitles. I was like, hang on, the subtitles would have no way of knowing which
They have
kind of
no way of
fantasy.
knowing. They would sort of fantasy with F and fantasy with F.
It would have the same challenge the human mind has.
Yeah, right.
So I think what would be helpful, I mean, listeners to this show will have heard sort of varying conversations around, this idea of, say, projections. But I think that might be a really good place to start to really understand when we're talking about the phantasm kind.
Yeah,
Would you just give I know this is a conversation that could take 50 episodes to
sure.
cover, but could we have a bit of a 101 in terms of like what's happening when we're talking about projections?
So generally, when we're talking about projections and how that ties into like the phantasmical fantasy, the projections tend to be phantasmical
Mm.
because projections are unconscious material, and that unconscious material is coming out unconscious, subconscious. And I'll take a moment to make a distinction between those two things, because that may be helpful. The subconscious is the personal unconscious, at least from a Jungian perspective or a bit more of a psychoanalytic perspective. And the unconscious is the bit more collective unconscious of general, very abstract unconscious psychological content. The subconscious is personal unconscious in the fact that this is unconscious material that um, uh, has been buried over time through conditioning, programming, societal norms, familial norms, etc., that sort of oppress, in a way, the maybe the authentic expression of a person, right? And so and whatever that is, and this is a big generalization, but whatever that content is gets buried underneath that conditioning and programming of who society, etc., thinks that you're supposed to be, and we introject that and make that our identities. So predominantly what the phantasmical, because there's some sort of conscious content in there, the specters of the past, there's an experiential loss of something, then that's going to be predominantly subconscious material or personal unconscious material. And so because that's predominantly subconscious subconscious or personal unconscious material, then most of what projections are is going to be coming from that phantasmical perspective of fantasy of
Mm.
what we're projecting onto the world is the hopes and dreams, the silent expectations, the nonverbal expectations of what we hope life will be doing for us so that we don't feel so scared
Mm.
and unsafe and fragmented.
Yeah. Would it be helpful just to I'm just thinking it through the lens of like someone listening saying, but given my experience, is, you know, in this area so difficult, like say for example my relationship is so difficult, why on earth would I be projecting something like William's saying, you're projecting something that kind of creates the kind of life that I can't remember exactly how you word, you almost like I think I
Sure.
want. I don't want this.
Right.
Why would I be projecting that out there?
Well, in that moment when there's a discord that's arising in the relationship, and the thing that's occurring is not what the person wants. Actually, yeah, there's some layers in that question, because there's the reality that, and I think it's important maybe, to just sort of take a little time to dismantle that a little bit, or dissect that a little bit, is that there's conditioning showing up in the orientation of the question,
Mhm.
which is why am I creating, why am I having this life, right, through my projections, if it's not what I want ultimately. And the conditioning being specifically is one part of it being that we are oftentimes conditioned to believe that we're responsible for our own punishments,
Mhm.
right? And so the life that we have, the life that's showing up now, is that we're somehow responsible for the pain we're experiencing, which is true and untrue. Like, I mean, we're getting sort of into paradoxical realms a little bit, but I think that's an important distinction to make, that there's an ego, there's a conditioning that's showing up, that's forming the question in that way for the first part. And that is phantasmical, right? So that's going to be the fantasy of that you are somehow responsible for how the other person is showing up, right, in this situation, that the relationship seems like the other person is not doing A, B, and C, which is things that you would hope that they might be doing in the relationship, and how you're perceiving that is also through a phantasmal lens. You're not really, as the Lacanians will say, or Jacques Lacan, who's a psychoanalyst, we rarely see other for who they are.
Mhm.
We see them for who we imagine them to be. So that's one. So that's one layer of that. When it comes to the more specific projections of, you know, what the relationship is in contrast to what we might hope it would be, what the hope is specifically coming from the specters of the past. And I think a more concrete or practical way to sort of terminology, or put terminology on that, is to recognize that the specters are unmet needs.
Mhm.
And so from the past, usually in childhood, and those unmet needs are now being projected onto the other, who we're not really seeing them for who they are. We're seeing them as our fantasies of our hopes and dreams of maybe salvation from the pain that we have from an unmet need.
Can I
And
just
that
pause you
creates
there? Just, I think that's
yeah, yeah,
a
yeah.
really helpful distinction you made. I guess just to put an extra kind of level of lens on this, it's the phantasm is you said it's kind of your unmet needs. I suppose you could say it's the ghost, the being, the symbol that could meet
Yes,
those unmet needs is what's being
exactly.
projected.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's like the ghost being the spirit of the thing that could have been.
Yes. Mm.
Yeah. And so that's, and then yeah, it gets projected as a symbol. So oftentimes when we hear it even today in today's nomenclature, and discourse around relationships, is that, like, I want a man or a woman, a person, to be this kind of way, right?
Mm.
That's my hopes and dreams for my partnership. And oftentimes in relationships, because we're not aware of this sort of distinction of how much we're projecting onto the world between phantasmical sort of fantasy and the fantasy as a tool with an F, because we're not aware of that, not only do we project that onto the world and we say, this is what I want, but as potential partners, we will also go, well, I hope that I can put on the mask and play that role, right?
Mm.
Because we're all sort of trying to get our unmet needs met,
Mm.
but we're not consciously aware of what those are specifically. So we have a lot of hopes and dreams about who's going to meet them, and maybe we find somebody that can meet them.
Mm. It's I was just feeling that it's this real kind of compassion for our innocence, the way that we're kind of projecting this phantasm and then also simultaneously trying to play the phantasm of someone else, and
well, and
simultaneously
that's
doing that.
and well, one, the innocence of that. This is why I do inner child work, right? Because it's so much of it is a childlike process. It's we're very much unconscious of what we're doing to a large degree as a populace. Now I want to be clear, that doesn't mean that we don't hold those things accountable, like we do. But the way that we hold things accountable tends to be in the shape of blame and shame and guilt, right? I think there's still a need for accountability, but I want to make sure that statement that I just made is not an opportunity to bypass, right? Because if we're all innocent children, then how can we be held accountable? We can still be held accountable through that process, but what we want to mitigate is the shame and the guilt that we tend to project onto people as a result of that. But anyways, but yeah, that's why it's so important, because there is an innocence there. We don't really understand what we're doing in those processes, not really at all. Yeah.
I think what you were just saying there about that kind of, I think that can be one of those early stages. I'm not to say it only exists at the early stages, but certainly I think it particularly exists at the early stages as people start to recognize, oh gosh, this is what's happening in here that I'm projecting out there. Very much that kind of blaming orientation can come about. And I think, in fact, I think it'd be really helpful if you wouldn't mind speaking a little bit about the difference, like when you're talking about being accountable, how that is different to self-blame.
Yeah, well, I mean, I take the position of and I can't ever get his name right, but I'm gonna say it, Gabor Mate.
Oh yes, you said it well enough that I recognized it.
Yeah, good. Okay, I'll be honest with you.
High
I have yet to take the time to learn how to pronounce his name accurately, and I apologize for that. If you're Gabor, if you're ever listening to this, I apologize. But is the position that we don't come into the world with these things. We don't come into the world with shame, blame, or guilt. Like that's something learned, right? And so
it's another fantasy with a PH, isn't it? Really?
Well, yeah. It's societal norms. It's conditioning, right? It's the fantasy with a PH of hopes and dreams of the parent being projected onto the child, right? In fact, Jung has the statement, which it sums this up as well, which is that let's see if I can get it right. Something to the effect of the greatest atrocity that a parent can do, and I'm butchering this. I'm not quoting it.
I can do a better job. The greatest burden a child can bear is the unlived life of his parents.
There you go. Thank you. Look at you. Thank you for rescuing me on that. I appreciate. Yeah, that's true, right? It's like the unmet needs, the unlived life of the parent gets projected onto the child, and that's where that's where shame, blame, and guilt comes from. The shame, blame, and guilt comes from the parent that is not accountable without shame, blame, and guilt for themselves, for their own unmet needs that they're projecting onto their children. And so then we as children learn shame, blame, and guilt to be synonymous with accountability, and they are not the same things.
Yeah. I really love that. Looking at those words, unlived lives, through the lens of unmet needs. I think that's really helpful distinction.
Yeah, I agree.
So I just want to see if there's anything more I wanted to look at with regards to the PH version before we move on to the other one. What's really striking me is there's some kind of irony kind of out there in the kind of collective where there isn't perhaps very much consciousness of the work that we're talking about, where ironically fantasy with an F is kind of made wrong and ridiculed, dismissed. Even though
and I'll say that shows up oftentimes when I have made posts about things, that the projection that happens with that word is often associated with the idea that somehow fantasy is bad, and of course it's not. But yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
it's just I think that's striking me at a whole nother level. It's like the irony is the fantasy with a PH that pretty much all of us are doing all the time goes like unseen, and then the functional, healthy, beautiful, exploratory version with the F is the thing that's
Right.
demonizes. There is some
Yeah.
irony there.
Well, yeah, and but it's also understandable when you are as a child and you're raised in a world that systemically, it has no real sense of, excuse me, authenticity. Like it really has no. It has it because the authentic sense of self is lacking within the systems that we live in, and that's objectively true in the sense of how we painted this here is how much we phantasmically project onto the world. We're clearly not conscious of our own authentic self, and through the conditioning of shame, blame, and guilt, something must be blamed, and the thing that needs to be blamed must be fantasy, right?
Mm,
Like
yeah.
that's the reality of so much of that conditioning. And because so much of, to tie that in further, like as a child, because the authentic sense of self is lost, what is perpetuated is the need for an externalized identity, meaning that we find sense and meaning through other
Mm,
parents, family, friends, society, whatever, and partners. And so as a result of that, our whole system of accountability is completely dismantled. Like real self accountability would, it takes the opportunity, takes the time to go, what are my phantasms? What are the phantasmical fantasies that I'm projecting on the world? What are the fantasies with an F that I'm projecting onto the world? It has a conscious relationship with those things. But all of our systems of conditioning say externalize your identity, find purpose and meaning in other. So likewise, our psychological understanding of sense of self is how do we continue not looking at ourselves to hold
mm,
ourselves accountable.
yes.
Instead, we say the fantasy of other people is somehow dysfunctional and wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. So, hmm. There's a question that I want to ask, but I think it might be better to just spend a bit more time. I know you have already to an extent, but I think spend a bit more time exploring what we mean by fantasy with an F. W-
Okay.
What does that look,
Yeah.
feel like? How would we engage in that? How would we know it's one versus the other?
So I think it's really important to emphasize that like fantasy with an F, I would suggest is like an aspect of natural curiosity. As a child, the very motor skills that we developed is out of that same sort of curiosity. What is a thing that interests me? I want to go in that direction, right? Children will often, I say this regularly in my client sessions, but the idea of so much of our curiosity, it shows up at a very early age, even especially once we find some sense of mobility or even the idea of mobility. If
Mm,
we recognize that we can move our hands and grab a thing, we oftentimes will put it in our mouths. It's this idea of what is a thing? I want to know what a thing is,
mm,
and how do I associate and relate to it? That's lost over time. I mean, that's fantasy, right? There's a part of it in there where it's not consciously developed, at least as far as I'm aware. Maybe there's some research out there that says, oh yeah, as far as I'm aware, it's not consciously developed in the sense that there's a conscious awareness around imagining and fantasy as an early child. But the libidinal sort of impulse, the natural impulse to be curious about life, to have a desire to learn about things, is deeply tied into imagining and fantasy. I wonder, right? Even if it's not
mm,
consciously, cognitively, linguistically said to our, there's an impulse unconsciously there that's driving a child to discover the world. And so, but through conditioning and programming, that's lost, right? We lose that natural sense of curiosity about life. How fantasy with an F, shows up and can be very helpful once we have the conscious awareness of our own phantasmical projections. that we can bring our imagination online in a conscious way, in a much more objective way, that allows for us to understand that we're utilizing fantasy as a tool. And I think
Mm.
predominantly that's what it is designed for psychologically and spiritually, is that fantasy and imagining is specifically designed for us to self-reflect, to get to know thyself completely. But we can't do that if it's distorted by the wounds of the past. So as we continue to take accountability for the phantasmical practice of fantasy making, and we differentiate and we clear up that distortion, then we're able to see more clearly what is directly in front of us, even if we project the fantasy on it with an F. It becomes
Mm.
the fantasy with F at that point becomes a tool of understanding what our unmet needs are symbolically.
Mm. Yeah, I love this. So I like that phrase that you use, like that I wonder dot dot dot. And so I
Yeah,
think what you were saying that, we don't know, but in early childhood, that may just be completely open. So it probably
yes,
doesn't maybe represent what we might consider fantasy. But we
right.
don't honestly, we don't know, do we? Our children
As
thinking,
far as I'm
oh,
aware, yeah,
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 if I
yeah,
do this, will this happen or will that happen? Or whether it's just like I have an impulse to move towards something with that kind of, as you say, like a wonder. Um,
yeah.
Whereas I guess that can come in a number of forms as adults. Sometimes it is that very open-ended curiosity, like I've no idea where this is going to take me, but I feel this like move into that direction. Or sometimes it may be that we do have a sense of like, oh, this could happen or that could happen. Um, I guess the challenge is, and I guess this is where the two are just the two types of fantasy are constantly interplaying. It's that sense of being moved towards something, that kind of I wonder,
Yes,
can often be one way or another still motivated by the PH version.
absolutely, 100%. And
Mm,
that's why I like this, like accountability is such an important practice of this, is that and having an objective lens about ourselves, a self-critical lens without shame, blame, or guilt. Because, when my suggestion would be is that even when we have a clear sense of our fantasy making with an F, it's still likely driven by the phantasmical specters of the wounded past, right?
mm,
And I mean, psychologically, our coping and defense strategies are pretty insidious that way, where they until the wound, the fragmentation that those coping and defense mechanisms are built upon is really addressed and reclaimed and integrated. Those coping and defense mechanisms are going to do everything they can to make sure that they are continuing to do their job, which is protect the wound. So that, like, they will find the way to manipulate any sort of conscious awareness that we have
mm,
around what we're experiencing. So yes, even when we go, oh, I can intellectually understand the wound that I've experienced, right? Or I have a sense of even a somatic response to something, of I somatically can feel into the pain of some deeper wound, and that gives me some sort of cognitive awareness around the thing. That's just the beginning of the work that needs to occur with this concept of fantasy versus fantasy with a PH or an F, is because just by naming it doesn't give you the information. I can know
mm.
somebody's name, right, and not know them intimately as a person. Um, that it takes sitting down with that thing you have named and still getting to know them over years. And there and so long as we continue
To like
to,
continue the I think that's
you got
such a
to
great
continue the
metaphor.
curiosity, you got
Yeah.
to continue the conversation.
Mm,
Yeah, you have to, it's not just about naming something, it's about continuing the investigation.
mm. Yeah,
And
the
really, and when I
example
say
of
investigation, I think this is
mm,
important. I as on a relational aspect of that, when I say investigation, like as we've gotten to know, like I speak sort of Vulcan at times, right, or like very scientifically, but what I really mean is intimacy. Like, become intimate with the thing that you have named, and be mindful of how you might be projecting the fantasy, either like either fantasy with an F or fantasy with a PH, how you might be projecting onto the thing that you have named and othering it through your own fantasies. Like really get to like really hold all that accountable and get to know it on a deep personal level as it is, not as we imagined it to be.
How would you say that we're able to start to know whether, if we're in the work of like really noticing these things
Yeah.
and doing the work to integrate whatever was creating a particular fantasy, how would you say that we do start to have some sense that it's no, like it is a kind of, it is the F, not the PH, or it's more F than PH?
Right. My suggestion would be never allow yourself the grandiosity that you have it. Like continue. What I mean by is to stand fast and hold fast to the fabric of accountability, right? And just remain there, because then you just live it. Like I mean, on a psychological level, like on a psychoanalytical level, I think it's important for specific individuals that they have like the inclination to get into the data collection and the analytical drive of what marks the distinction between fantasy with an F and a fantasy with a PH. If that's your drive, then there are specific ways, and there's books that I could recommend and all that stuff that would move one into that direction. But as a general sort of process for the general populace around that might listen to this podcast, it would be to just hold fast to accountability, to be self-critical. Hold fast to that, because the fantasy with an F will show up naturally, and you will just live and breathe that. And if we try to find a thing that says, "Oh, but I'm doing," the reason that, and I want to be clear too. I recognize the reason why sometimes like that sort of specific information can be very helpful, because so much of what we're doing when we're doing personal development work and psychological work of any kind, healing work of any kind, is we're looking for answers because we're scared. And that's I recognize that. And some of the distinctions that need to be made, the specific practical means by which we know we're doing a good job, is there because of the fact that we're scared of the unknown. And I get that. With this one specifically, that would be my general advice: is just find a visceral self accountability, remain curious, and learn to be comfortable with self criticism without shame, blame, or guilt.
Yeah. And funny enough, this only came from conversation between us, I think it was this week, where again, when you're using that term, self-criticism, word criticism often comes with this baggage of it sort of being blame and judgment.
Yeah.
You mean
Yes.
it again, very similar to the way that you might use accountability, like it's just a pure like discernment and
Yeah.
not a sense of wrong making.
Yeah, there's a lot of, words are going to mean whatever we want them to mean, to a large extent. However, part of my work with words, I think this is important to say, even for, just for the audience as well. But like, part of my work with words is to reclaim how much we've projected upon them. And words themselves, because they're linguistic and because they operate through the mental faculties of ourselves, they are naturally dualistic. So all words have a dualistic frame, and I often say that words have like a dysfunctional component and a functional component. And in this way, criticism and to be self-critical is a highly astute and functional process of anyone that wants a discerning mind over themselves. To really truly know thyself, we have to be able to be very critical of what and accountable of what we project onto the world. And unless we are able to dismantle what we projected onto the word criticism, like you were just saying, blame, shame, and guilt, unless we can hold that accountable, then then we don't have an intimacy with criticism in a way that is healing. So
yeah, that really makes sense. I was just pondering a conversation we were in earlier around archetypes and how archetypes can be, and I've got a personal kind of love of archetypes, hence for
Hmm.
me this is an example, but there's lots of
Sure.
others. But the way we can use things like the archetypes, and also, you know, myths as a whole, as a way of, I guess, like, again, exploring the fantasy of these things. And ultimately,
Yes.
you know, in doing so, often we will uncover the pH. But I'd love to hear you say a little
Yes.
bit more about how we can, um, I guess, use things that, you know, funnily enough, are seen as fantasies. You know, myths are almost like synonymous with the word fantasy, but like
Right.
consciously use them in that way. I'd love it if you'd be able to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge part of like sort of the Jungian lens of things to a large degree is the myth of things and how is it, what is the symbolic representation of myths, excuse me, and how does it apply to our own self-actualization? Jung talked about this. Just Campbell, obviously a huge person that looked at myth in this way. And the potency of myth itself and and specifically with archetypes, like a lot of people are talking about like the hero's journey these days. Like that's a pretty, and like also like the king and queen archetype are really sort of high in the collective projections. And the way that we would look, like the way, like it's, well, let's take king and queen for a minute. Like those are deeply symbolic and potent to people on levels that they likely don't really understand, right? They're not conscious of, but it feels resonant, and it feels resonant in some sort of way that um, feels healing in some capacity. To utilize this concept of fantasy with a ph and fantasy with an f as distinctions is or as a modality to some degree to look at the archetype that's arising with king or queen in this example would be to hold accountable that the king and queen, like unless you're an actual king and queen, like objectively in the sense that you rule over a nation in some way shape or form, then it's clearly symbolic, right?
Mhm.
It's objectively symbolic. Even I would suggest that obviously politically, like king and queen are roughly symbolic, but unless that's the case, then it's symbolic, and there's a desire to feel there's something that you're trying to reclaim through the archetype of yourself, right? There's some sense of in the archetype of king or queen for you specifically that there is, or for you in the general specific. There's the autistic thing, right? To be specific, yeah, clear. Through that lens or that archetype of king queen, what is the thing that you feel into that word, to that idea, to that archetype? What is it? And really begin to hold accountable and feel into the sense of it. When someone calls me a king or a queen, this is what I feel in my body. Okay, that's interesting. Take accountability of
Mm.
that. Um, when I feel that in my body, how does it make me feel? Do I feel reclaimed, safe? Do I feel whatever it is? And if especially and even if you like if you feel it in any sort of your body and you find yourself um, noticing it, well, in just any realm of your body, that feeling is likely tapped into a wound of some sort, right? That somatic response to the archetype, whatever it is, when we're having a conversation with ourselves about it or with other people, that feeling is tapped into a wound somatically. So the feeling itself is a projection of the wound, the actual objective wound. And that is where you can see just in that little bit of time, there's a direct linkage of the wound of the past that is tying into the archetype. And having a conversation with yourself about that will allow you to, and being self-critical and accountable will help you to be able to just begin dismantling the phantasmical projections of fantasy in that.
I love that. Would you say that if we take something like, actually, what's just come to mind is the story of Jung kind of building that kind of village over, I think maybe years, you know,
Mm,
using kind of, I think it was like actually rocks rather than blocks, wasn't it?
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
would you say that's an example of the kind of what we talk? I mean, I know there's a lot going on there, but in a way that is a kind of fantasy with an F. that kind of
Yeah,
endeavor?
yeah, it's fantasy with an F, and this gets into like what specifically with Jung. This gets into what we would call like active imagination, the
Mm,
idea of a conscious imagining. So his practice of a lot of what he did in his own personal life and his own self-criticism was in the land of imagination,
mm,
either predominantly internally but also externally, um, and that fantasy making in that is to a large degree that active imagination process that is you're consciously engaged with the feeling, the sense, the tactile, textures of things, how you want to build a structure in some way, whatever's going on, you're aware that you're likely projecting into that space. So what is that? And let's have an active process with
mm.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you get to see the phantasm out there in a way that is clear that they are, in a way, you could say.
Absolutely. Yeah. You
Mm,
then and also too, it's like container building. You're create like when you're conscious of something in that way, and this ties into like relationships. When you're conscious, when you approach a relationship, whether it's stones and you're trying to build a town, right, or you have like an actual physical relationship with someone, if we can be conscious of our own projections, then we can approach that relationship, whatever we're doing in that, with a very intentional practice of, I recognize that I have a lot of stuff that I'm bringing into this relationship. What I want to do is to build a safe container for both of us to project freely into that so we can have a conversation around it, either for just ourselves or with the other or as a team, but that we create a safe enough container to project conscientiously into with consent.
mm.
So like,
And be
in this
accountable.
case, and to be yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, because
Mm,
like that way you then are setting up a safe container for both individuals, hopefully, but at least the one individual to be able to self-reflect in a conscientious and consensual way.
mm. Yeah, that really makes sense. Unbelievably, the time has just absolutely flown by.
Oh well,
um,
okay.
yeah, I can't quite believe it. So there's lots more I could ask you, but I'm trying to move towards kind of asking you a final question. Um,
Sure.
so clearly what we're talking about here is, the work of a lifetime. We could literally
Yes.
spend at least one lifetime
At least one lifetime.
working through
Yeah.
all
Settle
of
in.
our
But as I
fancy.
often say to everybody I work with, buckle in. You're in it for the ride if you're here.
Yeah.
Not
Um,
happening overnight.
it really, really isn't. And
No.
so I know there's really nothing that you could say in the space that we've got that's going to be like, okay, now go do this, and you'll suddenly
Right.
see all
Right.
of what's going on. But
Yeah.
is there something that you think would be helpful for listeners starting to see like, recognizing, I have got the fantasies with a PH likely being projected into the world. And I'm really loving this idea of actually almost like reclaiming the the innocence and the health and the beauty of fantasy with an F. What would you suggest would be kind of like things to play with? And again, I'm almost using that word quite intentionally, like just again, like entering this in a light-hearted, playful way. What would
Yeah.
your suggestion?
Well, I love to springboard off of that. I love it because that's as we've been talking about it. I recognize that I think that this is where I would want to go with that question. Is is to so much of this work. Actually, let me back up just a minute. So what I do specifically is, at least attempt to do, is to help an individual to begin having an intimate relationship with their subconscious, as we like the personal unconscious. And the way that I frame that personal unconscious is the inner child. And the reason I do that is because the moment that the subconscious, like the personal unconscious, begins when begin to have some sense of a personality, of some sense of self, which I would say likely probably I'm speculating on this, but my the data seems to infer that that likely probably begins at birth because of the trauma of birth itself. That there's
Mm.
some distinction of oneness with mother and womb, and then suddenly we are pushed out and rejected as a result, and so that's a trauma. or at least, it's not a conscious trauma, but it's certainly, I imagine, traumatic. And so as a result of that, everything at that moment, there's some sort of personality that begins to develop. And that then is the container that we utilize that becomes the personal unconscious to a large degree. And so when you're talking about being playful, or how do we approach this in some sort of like loving, curiosity that is enjoyable, I think it's important to recognize that much of the spiritual work is to reclaim one's child. I often use the quote from the Gospel of Thomas when Jesus says that, when one of the disciples says, "How can we enter the kingdom?" And he says, "We'll enter the kingdom like these babes who are breastfeeding on their mothers." So much of the work that we're doing is the idea of going backwards through the conditioning and programming towards the child that we lost, towards the person that we were in the moment of our birth. Because after anything after that is just unconscious experience, either being projected onto us, or in the unknown ethers of, I don't know why I just got ejected from mother, right? Whatever it is. So
Mm.
there's just a whole bunch there. Much of our psychological and spiritual work is to go back to that place. And so I think it's important to emphasize that, because when we are taking a level of accountability and curiosity towards how we project on the world through our phantasmical sense of self, that while we're doing that, understanding that there's a child in there that is doing the best that it can to pretend to be an adult, to be the
Mm.
fantasy of what society and our parents have decided that adulthood is supposed to look like. And go play with that child. Go get to know that child. Have a conversation with them and say, I really want to get to know you for who you are and not what everybody else told you to be. Right. And in doing that, I think it creates a play, reciprocity of play between the two of you, because you're understanding as what we would say objectively, age wise, likely as an adult. Um, you have enough experience with children around you that you know what it maybe feels like to spend time with a child in some way, shape, or form. Most of us do. And so as a result of that, you as the sort of observer of the experience can be like this adult that comes in and is spending time with a child. But then the child also gets to have the reciprocity of being seen and heard and loved through the exchange. And in that process, you then can be like, oh, I see how that hurt. And I see how we were now upset with this person because of that hurt. And that was our phantasmical sort of experience, our fantasy of who the other was because of our own hurts. Let's talk about that. We can have a relationship that we can have an intimacy
Mm.
there. I think that is the sort of macro archetype that I would encourage people probably building a container in to play around in that projections. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. In fact, it has made me think, I think we need to come back and do a part two, very much focused on the child.
oh, I
You up
would
for
love
that?
that.
Mm.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's I mean that's the heart of what I do. So yeah, I would love to do that.
Yes.
Yeah, 100%.
Which is,
Yeah. Yeah.
as I said to you before, it's always been a focus of how I work, both personally and then also with students. But through your influence, that has become such a focus
Mm.
in a way that I wouldn't have imagined shifting in the way it has. So yeah, huge
And
gratitude to you for that. And I do feel like it's something that um particularly those of us that have been in this work for a number of years and are kind of, familiar with various kinds of inner child work, I think it's
yeah.
easy to miss the depth of what's actually not just possible, I really feel now like is needed, um,
Yeah.
which is what I've really
Well, and
seen
that
clearly from our conversations.
yeah, I think that ties into that insidiousness of our coping and defense mechanisms too, right? Like
Mm,
from the moment that we have a fragmentation that occurs, what we introject is, to a large degree, how do we protect that fragmentation?
yes,
And
yes.
And so much of it is deeply visceral, and I use the word insidious in the objective sense, not in like the sense that it's
Sinister,
like malicious or something. Yeah, that it's just very subtle and very, very complex, very sophisticated in the way that it is able to weave its way through any sort of rationalization that we create. And so, like this again, tying it back to that curiosity and accountability, and that self-criticism of a loving kind, those are like the formula that I give to people is self-acceptance, self-accountability, self-inquiry, and self-discipline. And that acceptance and accountability part is so important, because one, we must accept ourselves as we are, but then we also must be willing to hold ourselves accountable in every single way. And if we are unwilling to do that, then the coping and defense mechanisms will do their job well, and they will rationalize whatever fantasy, whether it's people talking about this. This is going to be my soapbox for just a second, but for people talking about 3D, 4D, 5D stuff, right? Or they're talking about Palladians, or whatever, and that's fine. Have fun in those realms. Like, I'm not saying don't do that. But whatever that thing is that gives you a sense of life and self, it's likely symbolic because of how sophisticated this process is. And when we actually take time to build a relationship with the child and have that accountability in a place there, acceptance and accountability, when those all come together and coalesce into a process and a modality for yourself, the rest of it goes away. All of that fantasy begins to melt away, because you're having an intimacy with the thing that is lost and is being projected into the fantasies of 5D, 4, whatever. You're having a real relationship with the thing that was lost. And that's medicine that I can't describe. So.
Oh, beautifully said. And yeah, I definitely feel like we've got at least an episode in us to go really deep in all of that, but I feel like that was a really beautiful way for us to close this episode. So, my dear William, where can listeners find out more about you and your wonderful work?
The best way to connect with me right now is on my website at psychodynamiccoaching.com, which I know that'll be in it's hard for me to spell that out, so I know that'll be in the footnotes or the show notes.
It's worse than the fantasy with a PH.
Yeah, right, yeah. But that's the best place to find me right now, because I'm not on social media lands for personal reasons. So yeah, that's the best place to find me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, William. This has been worth the wait. It really has.
It has been. I agree, 100%.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.